The Department of Education, why white supremacists still want it gone. I often wondered why the Republicans, the alt-right, or the various iterations of white supremacism in its various linguistic ideological forms of identification are so adamant about dismantling, defunding, destroying, completely gutting, or otherwise undermining the Department of Education. As I understand it, my research would never be able to illustrate any rationale for its creation as a move toward Black American reparation for the damage caused by unequal and inequitable education in this country. There would never be anything written or spoken that stated the Department of Education was created specifically to assure equitable and equal education for Black Americans under the law. Language being as important as it is, there could never be anything under the American law with the words affirmative action for Civil Rights Act 4 or Fair Housing Act for Black America or Black Americans. Not even the euphemistically favorable African American or people of color would ever be that specific in wording on behalf of Black Americans in the United States. Yet some laws are precise for other so-called protected groups, such as Asians and the LGBT+ community. Any law fashioned to help Black America is always hidden behind the shroud of neutrality, where being neutral in American culture was intended to represent whiteness as no longer a threat to blackness. At least not anymore. Through my research, however, I discovered that the Department of Education wasn't founded explicitly for Black Americans. Although its emergence during the post-civil rights and emergent post-racial colorblind eras centralized the enforcement of civil rights in education, making it a key mechanism for dismantling systemic segregation and inequity. This role, not its bureaucracy, is what has always made it a target of white supremacist backlash. As early as 1867, the precursor to the U.S. Department of Education, called the Federal Education Agency, was first introduced as a bill by James Garfield when he was a congressman from Ohio. White supremacist congressmen of that time opposed the bill because they perceived such a law meant educating newly freed Black people. In an article written by Jordan Friedman for History.com, the idea of an educated Black populace didn't sit well with many in the South, as well as some in the North. He elaborated further, quoting the Journal of Negro Education, that Fernando Wood, a staunch white supremacist Democrat from New York, contended that Congress was already doing too much to help formerly enslaved people in the South. Eventually relegated to an office in the Department of the Interior, it wasn't truly revamped into the Department of Education we see today for 111 years. In 1965, President Lyndon Johnson would expand the Bureau of Education Elementary and Secondary Education Act, and in 1979, President Carter signed the bill reinstating the U.S. Department of Education. By 1980, Ronald Reagan began willingly disparaging the department and explicitly sharing plans to eliminate it. In 1981, during his address to the nation on the Program for Economic Recovery, he began using rhetoric which is today a familiar series of tropes regarding the Department of Education as a budget reducer and preference for local and state desires in determining education. By eliminating the Department of Education less than 2 years after it was created, we can not only reduce the budget, but ensure that local needs and preferences, rather than the wishes of Washington, determine the education of our children. The full transcript of this speech is available on the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library website. Why white supremacists still want it gone. The white supremacists view the Department of Education as the vehicle for racial equity, especially in terms of affirmative action, DEI, and anti-discrimination compliance. Culturally inclusive curricula, meaning anything even remotely considered Black, which is why their targets are primarily Black literature and history. Federal oversight that curtails states' rights to control their education, which historically meant maintaining segregation, and explains why one of the rhetorical rationales is giving the responsibility for education back to the states. Some even call it the civil rights enforcement arm, disguised as an education agency. Conclusion. The Department of Education like all other attempts at preventative and reparative relief for black people, are purposefully being defunded, dismantled and disintegrated, pun intended, while still being touted as neutral and inclusive of all protected groups. Although every single attempt of elimination is directly aimed at black people in history, in literature, in equality, equity, opportunity, and injustice. Although I recognize I will never find something explicitly detailing the rights of black people using black people in any law, bill, or policy proffered by the United States government, it is as excruciatingly and crucially clear who is the target and has been the target for generations. Furthermore, I can damn well bet, as the vanguard of true democracy in America, it is incumbent upon all Americans to pay attention to efforts to eliminate these neutral protections that will eventually affect everyone.
I propose, and would have already started, if your hypothesis is correct, a planned and orderly transfer back to the states and local communities of functions the federal government has usurped and which it has proven it is incapable of operating. And one of the first of those would be welfare. One of the second would be in the field of education. I would like to dissolve the $10 billion National Department of Education created by President Carter and turn schools back to the local school districts where we built the greatest public school system the world has ever seen. I think I can make a case that the decline in the quality of public education began when federal aid became federal interference.